welcome to Goodwin University's 9 and 9 webinar series. My name is Anjanette Benar, and I am the director of the Center for Teaching Excellence, and I'm thrilled to be your host today, and thank you so much for joining us. This marks the third season of the 9 and 9 webinar series, proudly sponsored by the Center for Teaching Excellence at Goodwin University. And Goodwin University is a small career-focused institution located in East Hartford, Connecticut. We have an open access model and a high percentage of first-generation students, so Universal Design for Learning has been truly transformative for our community. Through nearly a decade of UDL-focused faculty development, we've cultivated a strong culture of inclusive, learning-centered design. And this series is designed to help connect current UDL research with the UDL guidelines, supporting practical and meaningful application in teaching and learning. So a little housekeeping before we begin. This is being recorded, and we will share the link and the materials afterwards. We'll also be putting in our Padlet. I do have to do a little plug for our conference in Connecticut on October 2nd. So if you are in the area, registration has opened. I just want to point out that there are some AI closed captioning by clicking the More button, the icon with the 3 dots on the bottom toolbar. So, without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Shawn Durrett. She is the Associate Director of Learning Outcomes Assessments at Greenfield Community College in Massachusetts. A seasoned English teacher, administrator, and educational consultant, Shawn Durrett's career in education spans over 25 years, including elementary through college level experience in both private and public institutions, with significant experience facilitating professional development and mentoring faculty. She brings an asset-based, responsive approach to her work and is committed to an anti-racist and culturally sustaining practices in school. Driven by a core belief in learning potential of all students, Shawn supports student voice and the power of reflective practices. So welcome, Shawn. I'm going to stop sharing and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So let me get set up with that. All right, should be loading here. Welcome, everyone. I am joining, as Anjanette said, I'm working from home today in South Deerfield, Mass, but work at Greenfield Community College. Many of you are on the webinar today are close enough to be in my neck of the woods here in New England. So happy to see the sunshine out today and hope the same is true for where you are. Today I'm going to be talking about universal design for learning, specifically as it relates to assessment literacy and helping students understand the what, why, and how of learning. And as I was introduced, I really approach this work from my experience as a classroom teacher. So I'm aiming to make this very sort of practical, tangible, talk about hands-on techniques that can be immediately employed in the classroom. But I really encourage you, if you have questions or thoughts, feel free to unmute and ask them at any time or put things in the chat, and I'll try to follow along with everything as best I can. So the UDL principles that we're going to talk about today, that I'm going to focus on in my presentation, are under designing options for welcoming interests and identities, optimize relevance, value, and authenticity, and under design options for sustaining effort and persistence, clarify the meaning and purpose of goals, and optimize challenge and support. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about the use of exemplars and the role and purpose of faculty transparency and clarity in assignment design. So, a little bit about me. As I said before, I have been an English teacher for over 25 years. A fun fact about me in the classroom, my favorite book to teach is Beloved by Toni Morrison. Some of my favorite teaching and learning topics include assessment at both the micro and macro level, curriculum development, literacy and writing skills, universal design for learning, and the hot educational topic that is most on my mind this year is AI literacy, which I assume is true for many of you as well. And for me, I'm thinking a lot about not just AI use in the classroom or um, policing student use of AI. I'm really thinking about what we can be doing proactively to develop AI literacy. And there's actually a little part of my presentation that overlaps with that as well. All right. Why is my screen not advancing? Okay, here we go. Learning objectives for today. There are three main ones. The first is explain key research on assessment literacy and how transparent assessment design supports student self-efficacy and success. We're going to identify ways to use exemplars so students understand assessment expectations and criteria, and recognize effective strategies for unpacking rubrics to help students understand performance levels and expectations. So I'm going to put three claims up here, and I'll invite you in the chat to make a comment about these claims in just a minute. The first claim is assessment literacy is underdeveloped. Second claim is that transparency increases confidence and belonging. And the third one, claim C, is exemplars build understanding of quality. And in the chat, I would love you to just put a brief comment, A, B, or C, which one of these claims is most relevant to your students and your experience? Meaning, which one of these do you see showing up the most recently or overall in your experience? And if you want to put a comment about why you think that is so, feel free to add something else or just make a little note of which claim seems most relevant and prominent in your experience at the moment. All right, B and C getting some focus in the chat. Okay. All right, great. Keep any other thoughts coming about these claims. These are things that we'll be talking about throughout the presentation. There is a lot that's being talked about in terms of assessment literacy being underdeveloped at the higher ed level. If anybody has worked in elementary, middle, or secondary, I think that when you compare those different levels, last year I taught sixth grade for the first time. It was sort of like a in-between year. I took a sixth grade teaching job. And man, is assessment literacy highlighted so much in elementary curriculum. There's so much intention on helping students understand the what, why, and how of what they're expected to do in the classroom. And I think as students go up through the levels, we tend to move away from that and make some silent assumptions about students' understanding of why we're asking them to do what we're doing in the class. That does not happen in higher ed. I'm assuming that comment means that focus on assessment literacy at that specific elementary level doesn't happen in higher ed. But if you meant something else, please feel free to clarify. So I'm going to start with a little assessment story from seventh grade science class. Yes, thank you, Dr. Mackey's Bradley. My first pop quiz in seventh grade, I was a new middle schooler at a new school. I had gone to elementary school at a very non-traditional sort of experimental kind of one schoolroom model in Western Massachusetts. There were 7 students in my grade. We had mixed age classrooms. We did a lot of hands-on, holistic, like intertwined curriculum that was very emergent based on students' interests. Students were driving a lot of the curriculum choices. We didn't have textbooks. We didn't have grades. I had never taken a standardized test, let alone a teacher-designed test in my life. So showed up at a much more traditional seventh grade with, lockers and desks and textbooks and teachers and grades. And it was just a completely new and different experience for me. So when Janelle Windsor gave us our first pop quiz, I looked down at it and had no idea what it was and turned to the student sitting next to me and asked her, "What is this all about?" And she kind of furtively whispered, "It's a pop quiz. You just got to fill it out, be quiet, da da da." So I did my best, turned it into the teacher, and she pulled me aside and she said, "There is absolutely no talking during quizzes. You can be suspected of cheating. That's completely inappropriate. If it happens again, there will be consequences." Now, this was obviously very low stakes. I was a new seventh grader in a system designed to get everybody on equal playing field, with lots of scaffolding, with lots of understanding that young students are going to make mistakes. But I was horrified, absolutely horrified that she thought I was cheating. And I didn't have the language or the kind of intellect to explain to her, "Look, I don't know what a pop quiz is. Like, I sat around in elementary school and did beading projects and, counted with an abacus. Like, this is totally outside of my wheelhouse." Um, but the point of this little story is that the stakes obviously become much higher when we're talking about students at the upper levels. And I teach at a community college where we have many examples of non-traditional learners in our classrooms, as all of us do. We have adults returning to education, we have first generation college students, we have English language learners. And we want to be really careful about making sure that as teachers, we're creating equitable classrooms that remove hidden barriers for students. And often those hidden barriers are what's left unsaid. What might students not know and understand about what is expected of them in a particular assignment, how they translate their past educational history into what we're expecting in our classrooms. But simply put, some college freshmen may never have been asked to do a robust research assignment or a lengthy lab report or a case study presentation or whatever it might be that we're asking of them in our classrooms. And so, what I'm really going to focus on is talking about removing some of those hidden barriers. And one of the best ways to do that is transparent assessment design. So, the teaching intervention that I'm going to focus on a lot today is this transparent assignment design template that was developed by Wink Elms. And I have a little clip on the previous slide where she's talking about this. If you look at the slides after, you can check that out. And I have some of her resources included in the resources with this presentation. But she did a big study and then reported that students who received more transparency reported gains in three areas that are important predictors of students' success: academic confidence, sense of belonging, and mastery of skills that employers value most when hiring. The benefits for all students who received greater transparency were statistically significant and substantively important. For first generation, low income, and underrepresented students, those benefits were even larger. So on this next screen, you'll see this is an example of the transparent design template that she came up with around, I think it was around 2009. The template that I've linked here and in the resources is one that is adapted, so they've added a little bit more information. But this is using the TILT framework, which stands for Transparency in Learning and Teaching. And the idea here is that faculty could use this assignment template to make sure that they're communicating with transparency all the important information that students need to know. The things that have been added on this template are the top row and the bottom row. Wink Elm's original focus was on the purpose, tasks, and criteria for success, but added to it, we would start with the aligned learning outcomes. And so defining the learning outcomes for the assignment that link to the course, maybe that link to the program learning outcomes in student-friendly language, so helping students recognize how the assignment will benefit their learning. Under the purpose, she separates it into knowledge and skills so that faculty can indicate how the specific knowledge and skills involved in the assignment will be important in students' lives beyond the context of the assignment, the course, or the college. Under tasks, you would list any steps or guidelines or recommended sequence for the students' efforts. This particular college where I got this sample from uses academic integrity icons that are specific to their own institution. Criteria for success define the characteristics of the finished product. And then examples. She encourages the use of faculty providing multiple exemplars so that students can see what the assignment might look like as produced by previous students. Help encourage students' creativity and reduce their incentive to copy any one example too closely. So that's really why she encourages the use of multiple exemplars, which I'll talk more about. So here's an example of using the TILT framework, those original three categories for an assignment in the science field. The course example is Introduction to Scientific Inquiry, and the sample assignment title would be Evaluating Posters for Scientific Evidence. So under purpose, the faculty member gives the purpose of the assignment is to analyze evidence presented in a scientific poster. They define how this will help the student. This will help you later in the course. And as a result of completing the assignment, then they have a couple bullet points in terms of what the purpose and the benefits of the learning are for the student. Under the task, they've provided a specific list of how students will read through the provided scientific poster and answer the questions. And then under criteria for success, they note something specific that they're looking for, complete responses to the questions that cite evidence directly from the poster. Sorry, trying to advance. And then there's also this transparent assessment design checklist that can be used as part of this framework. And this, I think, is a really practical tool to use yourself or encourage other faculty that you work with to use something like this, or it could be customized for your own department, program, or institution. But it's basically to help the faculty member check through how they've been designing an assignment and to see whether it matches the TILT criteria. So things like, does the assignment have a criteria for success section? Does that section define the characteristics of the finished product? Does the criteria for success section provide multiple specific examples? Those would be the different exemplars the faculty member would provide. And there's some other things that are suggestions that could happen in class, and I'm going to talk about these as well, such as will the instructor and students have collaboratively analyzed an example of good work before the students begin working? Perhaps not stated on the assignment, but done in class prior to distribution. Will the students have identified how excellent work differs from adequate work before the students begin working? And then does the criteria for success section include a checklist of characteristics of successful work, a rationale for how students' learning will benefit, will benefit from the uncertainty caused by the lack of information about characteristics of successful work? Will students use a checklist to provide feedback on peers' coursework? These are all options for what faculty members could do in class. Does the criteria for success section include whether this task will be graded, how it factors into the overall grade? And then will the instructor ask students to reflect and comment on their own work, etc.? So before I move on to the next slide, I'll just pause here for a moment. I'm curious if anybody has used the TILT framework, if you're already familiar with this particular transparent assignment template. Does anyone have experience designing assignments using these resources or something similar? And feel free to pop anything in the chat or even unmute. Thank you for adding some resources. Okay, great. Brian, adopting Tilt for a program helping to design in the coming year. Awesome. Anyone else having? Okay, cool. Oh, great. All right, glad to hear that folks are talking about it on their campuses. Oh, using AI to review my assignments according to the TILT framework. That's a great idea, Julia. I hadn't even thought about it. To use that as a specific lens through which to ask AI to review assignments. Great. All right, so moving on, now we're going to talk about how to use exemplars with this approach and the benefits for students when we use them. So from this article, Why and How Educators Use Exemplars, they talk about how when a range of good quality examples has been used, students have reported gaining insight into different ways in which a particular task can be accomplished. And in that little box on the bottom, I put the box straight from the transparent assignment template where she talks about provide multiple examples of what these characteristics look like in real world practice to encourage students' creativity and reduce their incentive to copy any one example too closely. So ideally, for a given assignment that is constructed using that transparent tilt framework, a faculty member would have a few different exemplars to share with students. And we want to ideally, I would recommend sharing exemplars at the two top levels of your, rubric or the criterion that you're using to grade, because we want to show students, we want to stretch them, we want to show them what good, solid work in that performance level looks like. And sometimes it's trickiest for students to distinguish between those slight variations of in traditional language, how we might be looking at the difference between like an A and a B assignment. And those tend to be the most helpful for students to look at samples. Um, there's a lot of different ways to present exemplars to students. One is for the teacher to annotate it and provide it to students through the very specific lens of what the teacher is looking for. So if I was teaching like an English Write 101 class and I'm trying to get students to think about how to incorporate quotations seamlessly into their own paragraphs and how to cite them properly and how to manipulate quotes grammatically to fit with their transition sentence. I might have very specific annotations on the side that call attention to those things. Obviously, if you're going to annotate an exemplar, you should be annotating it to match the criteria that students know you're going to be evaluating them on. So whatever your rubric is, picking out things to highlight in the student work that match the grading criteria that you're using, and that match particular skills or knowledge that you might be really highlighting in class, just to make it very clear for students. I also like doing color-coded annotations. I think this is a great exercise to do with students in class. Um, as an English teacher, I often taught students how to write quotation identifications where I might give an exam that was just lifted quotes, significant quotes from the literature, and they had to talk about and analyze the quotation in depth and connect it to the work as a whole. And so I would give students very specific instructions and really help them understand how the sample exemplar embodies what the task is asking them to do. So you could give a color-coded assignment or, sorry, exemplar straight to students, or you could have students do the coding in class themselves. I'm seeing a comment about accessibility challenges for some students using only colors. That's a great point, Kevin. So thinking about how you might make this accessible to all learners depending on who's in your classroom. Sometimes I've done this, in a secondary or elementary classroom when I had materials there with me. We don't always have those things in higher ed classrooms, but like sets of colored pencils, and I would provide those and ask the students to be highlighting or using highlighter pens. But this same thing, instead of color coding, could be done using, for example, margin comments or neatly handwritten annotations, or even done on a screen um, for students in front of them. So important to think about what are the needs of your learners and how you can make it accessible to everyone. All right, so other ways to engage with exemplars in class. Faculty could co-create assessment criteria in conjunction with discussion of selected exemplars. So you could have, before you even write your rubric, for example, you could bring in research papers or, um, excerpts from longer assignments and help students look at those exemplars and then come up with the assessment criteria together, essentially write the rubric together while looking at examples of students' work. Um, as I just mentioned, you could have students mark exemplars before or during class. They could do this with the rubric, followed by discussion and opportunities to ask questions. So having them take a really close look at student work, compare student and faculty marked exemplars, and have faculty explain their ratings. The point here is to take the time to really help students understand what quality work looks like in your discipline and how the expectations of the rubric or the grading criteria translate into their real world. A pair share marking activity could be a useful thing to do in class, where in pairs students look at exemplars and then maybe share in a larger group. And there are lots of different benefits to these strategies. So boosting confidence is huge for students, helping them really understand that they are capable. When they see examples, it makes things more concrete and more tangible for them. Reducing anxiety is a big piece of this, because when we remove those hidden barriers, when students understand, okay, this is what about the target length of my lab report or my analytical body paragraphs, just helping them understand what is expected of them and see past samples can really help reduce their anxiety. Visualizing possible approaches is really important, and we can get creative with the samples that we share with them. So there is not only one pathway to success in our assignments, and the more varied type of examples we can show them can open their mind to more approaches than they may have previously thought were possible. And the author of the Transparent Design Template also talks a lot about how, and I mentioned this before, but providing multiple exemplars reduces students' tendency to focus on sort of copying or trying to mimic one template. So having multiple things for them to chew on and think about tends to expand the possibilities in their mind. Gain knowledge and skills for task completion, that's obvious. Increase self-assessment. So also having students look at, your rubric or use exemplars as a lens through which to view their own work is really helpful. Enhancing trust so that students understand we're on their side, we're providing scaffolding, we're helping them understand what we're asking of them. And we want to talk about not just the products of their learning, but the process of their learning. And that's what we're really trying to support. Remove hidden barriers, as I mentioned. And then this bonus that I briefly mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, a really prominent AI misuse strategy that is like being used a lot right now, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, is just increased emphasis on the why of assignments and learning. That the more metacognition we can bring into the classroom and be asking students to think about what we're asking them to do and why. Why is it a benefit to do this assignment, but also do the work yourself authentically, da da da. Um, that can be a effective strategy for reducing the tendency for AI misuse. All right, moving on to step three. This is the last specific step that I'll talk about before some final thoughts. So step three is unpacking rubrics in conjunction with your exemplars. So as another way to make things really transparent for students. So again, from this article, Why and How Educators Use Exemplars, students explained how through close engagement with these tools, they gained understanding about what counts as quality in coursework, with some reporting that they found exemplars more useful and of greater value than rubrics and lists of criteria. And I think this quote makes a lot of sense. I mean, none of us as students in our own educational experience were taught how to unpack rubrics, or most of us, I should say. Typically, we're not taught that. But it's not an intuitive skill because rubrics are really like intangible, even to faculty, before you really put them into practice and use when you're looking at them in conjunction with student work. So, when we think about that, yeah, thank you, Kevin. Not sure if I even heard the word rubric until I was in grad school. I think if you were in elementary school right now in America, in public elementary, you would hear it. Again, I'm saying this through the lens of my experience as a parent now of younger students. And I think it's a product of more, prescribed curriculum and things like that. But anyways, so I just lifted like one row, one criterion from a biology research paper and rubric, just as an example to help us start thinking about, how are we going to get students to really think about what's the difference between proficient and exemplary, or 50 points on something versus 45, or whatever it might be in our grading system. So something that I like to do with rubrics is to not just provide rubrics to students in conjunction with, here's your assignment, here's how you're going to be graded, but through this whole transparent approach, design approach, to also really help them break down and understand how the rubric criterion live in their work. So I like giving them tips. I like giving them revision activities, things that are very concrete that they can do right in class or outside of class. So this is an example of a rubric criterion from the International Baccalaureate higher level English curriculum. It's a course I taught for many years as a 12th grade English teacher at the secondary level. And it talks about appreciation of the writer's choices. To what extent does the student appreciate how the writer's choices of language, structure, technique, and style shape meaning? Now, everything that we design ourselves, I'm always going to say, use student-friendly language. Yes. Thank you, Martina. And I love the single point rubric as well. This is from the prescribed IB curriculum, so it's a good example of a rubric criterion that is not written in student-friendly language. And students don't intuitively know what this means. So I give them a really specific tip. Use the author's name. It will force you to keep the focus on what the writer is doing. In literature, things just don't happen randomly, and students write that way all the time. The characters made bad choices, or the woods were ominous and frightening. Everything is designed by the writer, obviously. And when you have students like put the focus on the writer, it will help them meet this criterion better. I hope I'm explaining that in a way that's clear. I kind of garbled that, but I give them an example, of pre-revision and then post-revision. And then I tell them, okay, go through your paper and look at this. Anywhere where you're talking about a writer's technique, um, try to do it more specifically like this. Here's one way to approach it. So giving students not just, sorry, not just the rubrics, but activities and tips that they can do with them. All right. I just want to take a look at the chat. AI is a great tool for cleaning up our academic language and rubrics. Nice. To make them accessible to students also helps to differentiate within the rubric for all learners. I love that we've gotten two really nice tips for how to use AI in ways that are helpful and useful for teachers. Um, yeah, this is where I'd like to see AI being used in the ways that actually like solve a little problem for us, make our lives a little bit more efficient. All right. So moving into just a little bit of either chat discussion or taking yourselves off mute. I have some final thoughts to share, but I'll do that a little bit later. But I want to hear if there are thoughts and questions, other resources like please check out the single point rubric that Martina posted in the chat. I love that model. Concerns that you have, opportunities that you see, things that you are doing at your institutions. Would anyone like to share a thought, question, concern, opportunity, either in the chat or just by taking yourself off mute? Another interesting comment about rubrics in the chat, and then a comment about how this sounds like a lot of work. Kevin, I'm assuming you mean just this design approach to assignments and then the accompanying activities, etc. How do you help faculty and teachers overcome that? I would definitely provide resources and examples. So giving them the template and the checklist that come from directly from the TILT framework, I think that's really helpful. It could be helpful if teachers don't already have a bank of exemplars to preview this approach with them. Well, they should, right? Because they should be able to go into past courses and look at past examples of student work, although they need to be asking for permission if the work can be shared. But if they haven't already done that, to at least start previewing it with faculty so that they can, with intention, start out in a course and start building those banks of exemplars for anything that they anticipate using again in the future. So doing a simple, do I have your permission with anonymity, like I'll take your name off the sample to use your work as a sample in the future. Of course, in a time-saving way, this is again where I think AI could be useful. If you need to use AI to create a student exemplar that you then review yourself and see if it matches what you're going for and what you would want to share with students, or to create your rubrics, or to give you an idea for a revision activity you could do with a rubric. The exemplars, using AI to create exemplars, now that I say that, could be problematic if we don't want students to be using AI to create their writing. Um, anyways, um, what else? I mean, does anyone else have any strategies for how to help faculty manage the time it might take to implement this approach? Anytime there is a faculty member who has done it already and can speak to the benefits, that kind of promotion from within, I think is great. That if someone at the department level or in a faculty meeting can talk about it, that I think is great, and just reinforcing the benefits. I don't actually think it's that time consuming other than the exemplars, but to design your assignments that way, we should know all those things anyway. So just articulating it in the assignment design, hopefully, shouldn't take that much time. Um, yeah, typical response, start small, don't try to do everything all at once. All right, there's another question in the chat that I want to go back to. How do you get people on board with TILT when a lot of educators feel that implicit teaching, having students make connections on their own, is such a prominent philosophy? I would really talk about equity This is an equitable strategy. It's what's best for all students. And the having students make connections on their own, that's what the class content is for. It doesn't have to be in our expectations and in the structure of our course and assignment design. I think if you go back to talking about the hidden barriers and wanting to help all students achieve success, this is an equitable strategy, and that's what I would say to that. Um, I actually look back with great consternation on some faculty members that I had in the past, or even that I worked with, who I feel like didn't provide any scaffolding at all. This is a type of scaffolding. And that's not fair and beneficial to all students. Um, all right, great resource for experimenting teaching tools. I don't know what that is, but I will definitely check that out. All right, comment from Julia. The hope is that increasing transparency will reduce the amount of time faculty are responding to questions of I don't understand what I'm supposed to do. Hopefully it makes grading easier because more students will address the expectations. That's great. I hope so too. And depending, there are faculty who will feel that they can't do as much with like looking at exemplars and deconstructing rubrics in class because class time is so precious. But providing those resources anyway in your module, in your LMS, in your course structure, um, is can still be utilized by students. All right. I'm going to go on to some key takeaways and then anything else that anyone wants to share. Um, we've already talked about this, but assessment literacy is often underdeveloped and again, often can be sort of not talked about as much in higher ed. Students need clearer understanding of expectations and quality. Transparency helps improve confidence, belonging, and student success, especially for underserved learners. Exemplars make expectations visible. They show what quality work looks like across performance levels, increase confidence, reduce anxiety, and support skill building. Unpacking rubrics deepens understanding, helps students interpret criteria and apply them to their own work. And the practical universal design for learning strategies that we can employ are the using transparent assignment design, annotate and discuss exemplars, and engage students in rubric analysis and co-creation. Bottom line is that clarity combined with examples and guided practice makes for stronger, more equitable student learning outcomes. And that's a good thing to remind students, or sorry, faculty of as well. I'd love you to put in the chat if today's presentation gave you something to think about. What's one thing you'll try right away, or you could try? This is a way to just set a goal or an intention for ourselves. It could be looking at one of the resources that somebody popped in the chat. It could be using the TILT framework. It could be starting to think about exemplars for your next assignment. Thank you. And please look at the chat as people are adding things. If there's something else you can think of. Great. Thank you for adding all of those thoughts in the chat. When you see the presentation slides, you'll see some of the literature I consulted and then a list of additional resources. And there have been some great ones added in the chat as well. I'm going to stop my share and just pop back out into the main screen. If there are any questions, comments, things people want to discuss, or other resources people would like to share, please pop those in the chat, but I'll stay on. We do have a little bit more time, but is there anything else on people's minds that would anyone like to make a comment or ask a question? So feel free to pop off. Thank you all so much for coming and feel free to stick around if you'd like to chat for a minute. I'll stay here if anyone has any additional comments or questions. Thank you for coming.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everyone, for the conversation. And hopefully, we will see you at our next 9 and 9.